News Defense. In this edition, the CIA-Saudi connection, decades of close cooperation, and the program that has Riyadh funding U.S. training of Syrian rebels. Focus on Jordan's growing security challenges. For how long can the Hashemite kingdom remain a so-called island of stability? And a conversation with India's former Foreign Secretary, Shiv Shankar Menon. It's no secret that the CIA and Saudi Arabia have had a close relationship over the years, with Riyadh providing the funds to support many shared American interests. But today, especially in Syria, those interests are often conflicting. Here's the story of the recent cooperation to train Syrian rebels. With the ink dry on the nuclear deal with Iran and some conflicting interests in a range of Mideast crises, ties between the U.S. and Saudi Arabia are strained. But for decades, that relationship has been a very close one. And these days, the focus is Syria. In 2013, U.S. President Barack Obama gave the CIA a green light to arm Syrian rebels, with funding from a familiar source, the Saudi Kingdom. As reported this week in the New York Times, that mission, called Timber Sycamore, sees the kingdom putting in weapons and substantial funds, estimated at several $1 billion, with the CIA training rebels on assault rifles and anti-tank missiles. Prior to that, Saudi Arabia, along with Qatar, had been sending weapons to Syria for over a year, but the CIA was only authorized to deliver non-lethal aid to rebels. But not everyone in Washington has been on board, with some crying foul over the lack of transparency. In a statement, Democratic Senator Ron Wyden wrote that officials haven't provided the public with details about how this is being done, which U.S. agencies are involved, or which foreign partners these agencies are working with. The alliance was reiterated by the Saudi foreign minister this week, with U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry there trying to calm concerns.
We work with our American friends in these areas in terms of exchange of information, intelligence, in terms of training, in terms of ballistic missile defense, in terms of enhancing our defensive capabilities. We work with our American friends on trying to find a way to remove Bashar al-Assad from Syria.
It's far from being the first cooperation between Riyadh and Washington in the Middle East. Saudi Arabia has helped bankroll American interests for decades. One of the most obvious examples, Afghanistan in the 1980s. Both nations threw support behind the Afghan Mujahideen fighting the Soviet occupation. For Riyadh, that amounted to some $4 billion in official aid alone. By the mid-1990s, the rise of the Taliban helped fill the void. Today, the picture in Syria is even more complex, with a host of other nations deeply involved, including Saudi Arabia's ultimate rival, Iran, and Russia, with Washington walking a fine line in between them all. And many of the same questions are relevant, like which groups should be supported, how to do it, and who can put Syria back together in the future. And Barak Seener, an Associate Fellow at the Royal United Services Institute, joins me now. Barak, good evening. Thanks for being with me. So we're talking about decades of close cooperation between the U.S. and Saudi Arabia. In this very complex picture today, what is the U.S. relying on the kingdom for?
In an age where the US is increasingly slashing its defense expenditure, it's relying on local actors in order to engage in the region. It's traditionally relied on Saudi Arabia to project power into the region and to underpin its security architecture. As that's manifested in various forms such as training and increased, expanded weapon sales to the region. At the same time, however, the US is contradicting its foreign policy because while on one hand it's relying on the Sunni to project its power into the region, and it's also relying on the Sunni rebels in Syria, simultaneously it's allowing Russia to have a free hand. And Russia, like Iran, want to uphold and prop up the Assad regime. So this is a very, very sclerotic foreign policy. This leads Saudi Arabia to feel increasingly alienated from the West and increasingly undertake its own foreign policy initiatives. So it will intervene in Bahrain, it will clamp down on Shia, it will execute a Shia preacher. It will
without much reaction from the United States.
Without much reaction from the United States, and it will also put together an alliance to counter what they perceive as a Shia threat. They see a broader context. They see that when the Revolutionary Guard fires rockets very close to the USS Truman and there's no US response, then they think to themselves, we can't rely on the United States, and we have to take increasingly confrontational actions without running it past the United States.
And you mentioned U.S. defense expenditure actually lessening now. Now of all times, with the Mideast in such chaos and the U.S. involved, why now?
Due to this sequester is also as a result of the global financial downturn. So therefore, you will hear the United States speak about soft power, smart power, which is clearly branding for the need to substitute for real hard power, i.e. military expenditure. You've heard Leon Panetta say that the United States needs to rely on local actors or even Saudi Arabia to fund or place their soldiers into the fray. It's highly unlikely, and in that midst you have a huge power vacuum that is being created. You're having China entering that power vacuum, and it perceives Iran as being a key component in its Silk Road strategy. So it's developing infrastructure there, roads, aeroplane parts, oil refineries, etc., etc. You're seeing at the same time an oil price war between Saudi Arabia and Iran, with Saudi Arabia feeling that its OPEC leadership is increasingly threatened. All these things lead to increased confrontation. So
the bottom line I'm getting from what you're saying is that the U.S. sort of confused policy, this policy walking a fine line between Saudi Arabia, like in the CIA story we just aired, and between sort of betting on the Iranian horse, it's not working so well, that policy.
We see increasingly local actors taking independent initiatives without running it past the United States. We're seeing international actors with geopolitical vyings in the region. When American primacy is taken out of the equation, and you're seeing a parity between local actors with international actors entering the fray. You're seeing really pre-World War I scenario of nation-state actors in an incredibly volatile region. Confrontation increases, threat increases. So one needs primacy in order to create stability. Once that's removed from the mix, then risk and confrontation takes its place.
And very briefly, do you think stability is anywhere near in the near future?
No, it's increasingly unstable. We also have one final point. When Saudi Arabia feels that its reserves also are dwindling because of the oil price war, then you're going to see unpredictable and desperate measures taken in absence of consultancy with the United States, leading to increased confrontation.
Barak Seener, thank you very much for this.
Thank you.